So I just got finished watching this episode of This Past Weekend with Theo Von, and his guest on this podcast was one of my favorite artists, James Blake. It's almost a 3-hour conversation, so I wanted to take some of the best thoughts and highlights from it and condense them down into this video so you can hear about them. First of all, this collaboration was completely unexpected. These people are from completely different worlds. James Blake is a British electronic R&B piano type musician, and Theo Von is an American comedian from the South. The fact that their paths have crossed in some way is just crazy to me, but I really respect both of their art, and once this podcast came out, I jumped on it immediately. This podcast is really interesting and has some very inspiring conversations, and it's way deeper than I expected it to be. James really reveals a lot about his thought process, the things that he's been through, and his upbringing in music and how he got to where he is today. So I'll start with some of the lessons and important topics that I learned while watching this conversation, and then I'll also tell you a little bit about what James said he's working on. So pretty early in the podcast, they compare their artistic mediums, and Theo talks about how when he was growing up, the only way he could connect with people was to make them laugh. That was the way he emotionally was able to see through people and get a response out of them. And through his trauma and stuff, it was his way of making himself feel better. And he talks about how when you're growing up, in order to emotionally regulate yourself and feel better about things, you need to find an outlet and find something that helps you to take that emotion and put that energy in that. They kind of compare it to mountain climbing, where you're taking this emotion and using it as a foothold to get your way through life. They also talk about how their art, whether comedy or music, is a way for them to let steam out. And while it doesn't always let them completely fix those problems, it helps them get through them. After this moment, James talks about his intention in his art. This comes up because Theo says that when he hears James' music, everything sounds so particular and so intentional in every phrase, word, and sound. He compares it to, instead of just laying down concrete and no one knows who did it, it feels like a staircase where the person who built it handcrafted every single step. So James takes this as a compliment. He recognizes it and appreciates it, but he says that he doesn't always want to come across that way, and that feeling that people have towards James' music can sometimes paint him into a corner and kind of anchor him into one spot. James says in some ways that level of intention people hear in his music can make people around him feel like James always knows what he's talking about, which he says he doesn't. I think this is a very honest thing for James to say. He doesn't want to come off as too much of an expert. He doesn't want to say that he's the smartest person in the room. This is an example of his humility and humbleness, and I think it's really cool that he thinks of it that way. He's saying that he's not always an expert at everything, and that he's learning as he goes along, just as other people are. When talking about talent, he says he doesn't really believe in people being naturally talented. He thinks there could be a predisposition for somebody to have a level of talent, but he says he sometimes feels bad for musicians because the story behind some musicians reveals a really dark path to how they got to that place where music became that thing in their lives, where they were able to express their emotions because they had a problem where they weren't able to express it elsewhere in their life. He recognizes in this podcast that eventually in his life, he had to find ways outside of music to handle with that pressure. Music was only able to let off some of that pressure for him in his life, and he had to resort to other things, more holistic ways of approaching the problems in his life and the way he deals with his emotions. Like I said, he doesn't want to be anchored to his art. He doesn't want to be solely defined by it. He wants to be more than just the songs that he puts out. And all this talk about intention and anchoring reminds me a lot about what Brian Eno said in this interview that I covered just a little while ago. Go check that video out if you get a chance. Now, being a comedy podcast, something else that was funny is that Theo says that when he listens to James Blake's music, he feels like Eeyore that showed up at a rave. I think this is funny because it does kind of paint a picture of somebody being really sad, but they're in the club dancing as well. The next thing that I thought was interesting was how James was on the way to the Grammys when he had learned that he won a Grammy for Best Rap Performance. Which is funny because if you know anything about James Blake's music, he's not a rapper. The story is that Kendrick Lamar had asked him to work on the soundtrack for Black Panther for him, and James had sent some vocal part for one of the songs they were working on. During this time, they didn't meet in person. Somebody in the studio ended up chopping up James' vocal and putting it in this song, which would later become King's Dead. It wasn't really a vocal part, it was more just like a layer. It wasn't like a particular verse or a chorus or anything like that. It wasn't a real singing part. What was interesting is that they labeled James as a featured artist on the song, not just buried in the credits somewhere. So this means that James was able to get a Grammy when the song won Best Rap Performance. Kind of a funny story, and some people might be angry about it, but I think it's hilarious to see how James Blake has a Best Rap Performance Grammy. That's just hilarious to me. Later on, they get into a conversation about James and his studio. What does his studio look like? And he talks about how his studio is largely the same as it was when he was coming up in music. Yes, some things have changed in the sense that he's gotten higher quality equipment, but still, in essence, there's a microphone, there's a keyboard, speakers, and a computer. And then Theo asks this interesting question. He asks him, do you ever wish you can go back to that time earlier on where you had different gear and you had a certain type of inspiration so that you can tap into the emotions that were going on during that period of your life, where you had a fire in your belly for something in particular, whether it's a type of music, whether it's a certain sound in music, whether it's a certain subject you're writing about, like a lost love or something like that. James recognizes this, but he is glad for the change that has come in his life. Of course, he looks back and wishes that he could get back into the mental state that he had at a certain time, where some characteristics of his life were very inspiring. But he mentions that while we can't go back in time, what we can do is make sure that we are in a good headspace and we're on a clear path for what's to come in the future. That moment that we had only really lasted for that period of time. He thinks that the thing we're really missing is the feeling of being on a path, being in this flow state where you weren't looking back on things, but you were charging forward and you had something in your gut that was pushing you to make something great. It's the feeling that we are here to do something and we feel like we have a valid purpose of being on this planet. Your essence is why you're really there. It's not about this particular thing you're doing. Theo, he has all these analogies and he brings up a really good one here. He says that sometimes he's been in a part of his life where he feels like he's on a ship and there's a dock and he passed that dock by and he wishes he could get back to the dock. But James says that it's not about getting back to a certain dock. It's about feeling good being in the stream. The dock was a piece of scenery that you just passed by and now it's time to move on. James says it's like if you always want what you currently don't have, then you're always going to be starting from a deficit, and therefore wanting something equals unhappiness. James also says that he is constantly working on new music. He's currently working on some sort of film music. He doesn't really go into details, but he says it's not really like a narrative type of film, but more of a visual thing. So I'm really excited to see what that's going to look like down in the future. This is around the 145 mark if you're looking for it in the podcast. On the topic of getting bigger and becoming famous and such, James also talks about how sometimes he wish he could be the one in the crowd, and how sometimes as artists they isolate from the art and it just becomes a job. Theo expresses this idea by talking about how there was a certain point in his career where he felt like he couldn't take any influences in from other comedians because it would be stealing from them to take any influences, and he would isolate to the point where he wasn't watching any comedy and he was putting himself in a hole. They talk about how sometimes it does feel like a job because they work so hard to make their performances perfect, and they isolate from the moment and they isolate from the crowd and they forget to be with their audience. It's an interesting thought to me, thinking about how an artist who's so devoted to their craft can also isolate from it as well. James goes on to talk about how a lot of music that he works on eventually doesn't get put out, and how he's been in so many studios where he's heard things that it feels like a crime that nobody gets to hear it. You know, it makes me wonder, some of my favorite artists, some of James' music that I'd love to hear, you know, it's sitting on his hard drive somewhere and we may never be able to hear it. He talks about how he has thousands of songs on his hard drive, and some of them, it just feels like they missed their moment emotionally, or they never nailed the vocal take, and they didn't want to go back and redo the entire song. They didn't want to go back and record it. Sometimes they make a batch of songs that are in a particular sentiment, and only the one gets put out because it's the best epitome of all of that feeling. But either way, they talk about how there's a ton of reasons that music doesn't come out. I think that's important for musicians to hear, because it means that even the so-called pros, right, they make a ton of music that doesn't get put out. I think it's really important for artists to realize that you need to make a lot of music in order for some of it to be good, right? You need to go through the phases. You need to go through the steps of finishing music, even if it's not some of your best music. Even finishing that music that you consider to be not your best can come around and help you in your path to become a better musician overall. Theo asks him, what do you tell people who find a difficulty in expressing themselves? And James responds by saying that if you try to express yourself to somebody and they punish you for it, then maybe they're not the right person to be around. You need to find somebody who accepts you for who you are. He says that true confidence is knowing that even if there's somebody out there who doesn't like what you're going to do, you're still going to do it anyway. He says the fastest way to find out if you're in the right situation is to be yourself, and that will reveal everything around you. And if you keep adjusting yourself to other people, to other environments, to the things that are around you, then you're never going to scratch that itch of becoming yourself and having a true evolution and a true sense of self that is so empowering once you get there. You're always going to be trying to fit in other people's shoes rather than your own. And he does recognize that it is hard to get to that place, and it's hard because you have to let go of things. You have to let go of people who don't accept you. But ultimately, that might be the tough choice but important choice to make in that situation. So what did you find to be the most interesting part of this interview as we recap it here? Please leave a comment below and let me know what you thought was the best part of this interview, what you took away from it, and what really struck you in this interview. Like I said, this is way deeper than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be mostly jokes and stuff. It was maybe a 50-50 split. But honestly, there's so much really insightful information about James, about Theo, about their upbringing, and about expressing themselves. I think that's the number one thing that is the takeaway from this interview is expressing yourself and being okay in your own shoes. James talks in this interview about how when he was coming up, a lot of the press that was surrounding him was talking about him being an emotional, and he hated that because he hated the idea of somebody coming at him for expressing his emotions and working through his emotions through his art. They couldn't accept that fact, but he's totally embraced that, and he's become a bigger and better artist through doing that. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch me recap this interview. Thank you so much. If this is your first time watching my channel, I specialize in electronic music production for solo artists, and I'd love to produce a track for you. Go check out my website at onechannelproductions.com and let me help you make your next best song. Thank you so much. I'm Dan, and I hope you have a great day.